Last time we talked about choices, that we get to choose all sorts of things all day long. And some things give us no choice in our lives, but we have choices. And some of those choices impact the next 10 minutes. Some of the choices impact the rest of the day. Some of those choices impact an entire week. And some choices impact years. And some choices determine our legacy. As we've been going through the Bible, we've come to the point in Israel's history where they start to have kings. And all in all, there were 42 kings of both Israel and Judah. Now, we're not going to study every one of them, but we looked at a few kings last time and the legacies that they left behind. They were Solomon, and his legacy was he did what kept folks happy. Now, psychologists say there are people who are naturally more worried about keeping others happy, that there's something in the brain that makes them so concerned with if others are satisfied. And then there are those who couldn't care less if someone else is happy. But like we said last time, if at any point you're trying to live your life for God and trying to keep someone happy, and then those two paths start to split, which one needs to stop? Then there was the other king, and that was Solomon's son Rehoboam. And his legacy was he did what made him look good. Now remember, God told Solomon that because of his choices, the kingdom would be split under Rehoboam, marking for the first time in their history that Israel would be divided. And then we looked at Jeroboam, who became king over 10 of the tribes of Israel after Rehoboam made life even more difficult for Israel than his father did for them. And there was two things about Jeroboam's legacy. And the first was he did what saved his skin. And who did he sacrifice in the process? Well, he sacrificed only those people who he pointed to idolatry, which was everybody. And those priests that he called into service to the golden calves, only his children, everyone he was over. And he did it all to save his own hide. And the second thing about his legacy was he did what was kind of right. And you know what doing what kind of right is also called? It's called doing wrong. Because if you're not doing if you're doing what's kind of right, then you're not doing what's right, which means you're doing what's wrong. So each of these kings ended up with a legacy that no one's going to celebrate. But those are three bad legacies. As a matter of fact, of the 39 kings that came after, 31 were evil. Only 8 were called good. And the first was a king named Asa, who we talked about briefly last time. But when Asa becomes king, he simply says, I'm going to do my best to do what God wants. And that's his legacy. He did his best to do what God wanted. In 1 Kings chapter 15, starting verse 11, we read, Asa did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, as his ancestor David had done. Rehoboam wanted to look good to all of his buddies. Jeroboam wanted to save his skin and do what was sort of right. But Asa, the king we know very little about, says in verse 12, he banished the male and female shrine prostitutes from the land and got rid of all the idols his ancestors had made. He even deposed his grandmother Maacah from her position as queen mother because she had made an obscene Asherah pole. He cut down her obscene pole and burned it in the Kidron Valley. So like I said last time, he stands up to grandma. Can you imagine? I don't know if I could forcefully overthrow my grandmother. I don't know why I would. But grandparents are supposed to be the cool ones, the ones who spoil you. You're supposed to respect them and love them. But Asa kicks her out because following God meant more to Asa than any relationship with people. And that's what verse 14 says. Although the pagan shrines were not removed, Asa's heart remained completely faithful to the Lord throughout his life. See, that's what I want my legacy to be. Is that he wasn't perfect, but he did his best to do what God wanted him to do. And the last king we're going to look at is actually the youngest king, who is King Josiah. Josiah was only 8 years old when he became king. 8. I mean, that's unbelievable. And he reigned for 31 years. Now, to understand what Josiah did, we need to back up to a king who was arguably the most evil king in Judah's history, King Manasseh. Now, King Manasseh became king when he was only 12 years old, and he reigned for 55 years. And he did things that God called detestable. He reintroduced idol worship. He made altars to the pagan god Baal. He worshiped the stars, even threw his own son in the fire as worship of the sun. He did everything the opposite of what his father did, which was King Hezekiah. And King Hezekiah was another one of the good kings who did right. But his son comes along and he's so sick of his dad's goody-goody two-shoes Yahweh worship that he decides to undo everything that Hezekiah had done. If it was something that would have ticked his dad off, he did it. And he led all of Israel away from God in the process. Well, in all of that foreign God worship and altar building, the book of the law was lost. Now, what's the book of the law? Yeah, that is what we call the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, primarily Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, where they have all of their laws. Well, that's what governed everything that Israel did. And in that process of Hezekiah or Manasseh leading Israel to idol worship, the book of the law was lost. For 55 years, Manasseh did what he wanted, and he said, forget God, and that's exactly what happened. See, without the book of the law, the people had no teaching or knowledge of God. And so when his grandson Josiah becomes king, it's not that they were evil, like terrible people. It's Josiah's generation and the one before him grew up knowing nothing about God. And so in 2 Kings chapter 22, Josiah becomes king at age 8. And 18 years later, when he was 26, the high priest comes into Josiah and says, I found a book. I think it looks like a law book. And when Josiah hears the words that the priest was saying, it says he tore his robes, which was a sign of unworthiness, and said, God's anger is burning against us because those who were before us have not obeyed the words of this book. And so he gathers all of Judah and all the priests. And in chapter 23, verses 2 through 16, he says, the king went up to the temple of the Lord with all the people of Judah and Jerusalem, along with the priests and the prophets, all the people from the least to the greatest. And there the king read to them the entire book of the covenant that had been found in the Lord's temple. The king took his place of authority beside the pillar and renewed the covenant in the Lord's presence. He pledged to obey the Lord by keeping all his commands, laws, and decrees with all his heart and soul. And in this way he confirmed all the terms of the covenant that were written in the scroll, and all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. Then the king instructed Hilkiah, the high priest, and the priests of the second rank, and the temple gatekeepers to remove from the Lord's temple all the articles that were used to worship Baal, Asherah, and all the powers of the heavens. The king had all these things burned outside Jerusalem on the terrace of the Kidron Valley. And he carried the ashes away to Bethel. He did away with the idolatrous priests who had been appointed by the previous kings of Judah, for they had offered sacrifices at the pagan shrines throughout Judah and even in the vicinity of Jerusalem. They also had offered sacrifices to Baal and to the sun, the moon, the constellations, and to all the powers of the heavens. The king removed the Asherah pole from the Lord's temple and took it outside Jerusalem to the Kidron Valley, where he burned it. Then he ground the ashes of the pole to dust and threw the dust over the graves of the people. He also tore down the living quarters of the male and female shrine prostitutes that were inside the temple of the Lord, where the women wove coverings for the Asherah pole. Josiah brought to Jerusalem all the priests who were living in other towns of Judah. He also defiled the pagan shrines where they had offered sacrifices, all the way from Geba to Beersheba. He destroyed the shrines of the entrance to the gate of Joshua, the governor of Jerusalem. This gate was located to the left of the city gate as one enters the city. The priests who had served at the pagan shrines were not allowed to serve at the Lord's altar in Jerusalem, but they were allowed to eat unleavened bread with the other priests. Then the king defiled the altar of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom, and so no one could ever again use it to sacrifice a son or daughter in a fire as an offering to Moloch. He removed from the entrance of the Lord's temple the horse statues that the former kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. They were near the quarters of Nathan-Melech, the eunuch, an officer of the court. The king also burned the chariots dedicated to the sun. Josiah tore down the altars that the kings of Judah had built on the palace roof above the upper room of Ahaz. The king destroyed the altars that Manasseh had built in the 2 courtyards of the Lord's temple. And he smashed them to bits and scattered the pieces in the Kidron Valley. The king also desecrated the pagan shrines east of Jerusalem to the south of the Mount of Corruption, where King Solomon of Israel had built shrines for Ashtoreth, the detestable goddess of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the detestable god of the Moabites, and for Moloch, the vile god of the Ammonites. He smashed the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah poles. Then he desecrated these places by scattering human bones over them. The king also tore down the altar of Bethel, the pagan shrine that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had made when he caused Israel to sin. He burned down the shrine and ground it to dust, and he burnt the Asherah pole. Then Josiah turned around and noticed several tombs in the side of the hill. He ordered that the bones be brought out, and he burned them on the altar at Bethel to desecrate it. This happened just as the Lord had promised through the man of God when Jeroboam stood beside the altar at the festival. That's intense. I mean, this guy overthrows everything. He doesn't just get rid of idol worship. He destroys everything, going as far as pulling out the old bones of the priest who served under Jeroboam and those 2 golden calves. And he burnt them on the altars to the foreign gods. I mean, he's intense. He's serious. But here's his legacy. He did what was right no matter the cost. I mean, think about it. Josiah was overthrowing 75 years of tradition, of false worship, of wrong teaching. He was getting rid of priests. He was destroying the very thing that people thought was holy, all because of what God said in his word. He believed what God said. And when he realized that for all of his and his parents' and his grandparents' lives, that they had gotten it wrong and had been doing things that were not okay. And so he decided right then and there to change. And he didn't decide to change all of Israel. He didn't force others to change with him. Here's what it says in verse 3 of chapter 23. The king took his place of authority beside the pillar and renewed the covenant of the Lord's presence. He pledged to obey the Lord by keeping all his commands, laws, and decrees with all of his heart and soul. In this way, he confirmed all the terms of the covenant that were written in the scroll, and all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. He decided that he would change first, and then everyone else followed him. Inevitably, Josiah made enemies. I mean, when you do what's right, when you mess with tradition, when you mess with someone's tightly held beliefs, and when you start messing with people's power and influence, you're going to make enemies. But Josiah did what was right, regardless of what it cost him. And he didn't start with everyone else. He didn't start out by saying, well, this group needs to change this, or that person needs to get their life right, or he didn't say any of that. He started with himself. Later, when he was 39, Josiah went out to fight the Assyrians and Egyptians, and he was killed by Pharaoh Necho. Almost every other king was buried with their ancestors, meaning they only had one tomb, but Josiah was buried in his own tomb, which only honorable men got. The Bible says in chapter 23, verse 25, never before had there been a king like Josiah who turned to the Lord with all his heart and soul and strength, obeying all the laws of Moses. And there has never been a king like him since. And so we have Solomon, who did whatever made everyone happy. And we have Rehoboam, who did whatever made him look good. And we have Jeroboam, who did whatever it took to save his own self, and he did what was kind of right. But then we have Asa, who did his best to do whatever God wanted. And lastly, we have Josiah, who did what was right no matter the cost. And so which legacy do you think was better? More importantly, which legacy would you want? And as I said last time, this is the challenge again. Think about what you want people to say about you. And then you make decisions that will lead people to saying that. Next time, we look at the prophets.